to be all right. Amen. Amen. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Are you grateful, church? Yes, God is good all the time. Amen. Good morning again, everyone. And welcome to Advent. So we're reflecting on promise. And Doc gave a great reflection in the beginning on promise and the ministries and our chance to prepare during Advent. We all have had experiences with promises, I'm sure. Some good, some not so good. You know, we get started really at the earliest of ages. Children learn how to make promises, usually in exchange for something they want. Mommy, I promise I'll be good if you'll just let me have. Or it might come just before a punishment, right? I won't ever do it again. I promise. You see, we learn at a very early age that promises can make a difference. And that lesson continues and only gets stronger as we get older and the stakes get higher. Let me give you a little piece of legal advice. If you borrow money from someone and give them an IOU, and you'll have no obligation to pay them back. An IOU simply acknowledges the debt, but it says nothing about your intention to repay it. But give them a note promising to pay it back, and that's an entirely different story. Go home, check your mortgages, look at your car loans and your bank loans. The note that you gave them will start, I promise to pay. And that becomes legally enforceable. That's why it's known as a promissory note. Because promises make a difference. And even though promises are made about the future, they actually have a difference and make a difference in our lives right here and now. So if you promise to pay me money in the future, and I can rely on your promise, well, I can begin rearranging my life now based on that promise. Maybe I won't save as much now because I know that I'll be getting that money in the future. Or maybe I'll begin fixing up the garage now, knowing that once your money comes in, I'm going to buy a new car with it. You see, promises make a difference not only for the future, but for the here and now. But only if you can rely upon them. Today we begin the season of Advent. And for most of us, Advent is a season in which we prepare for Christmas. And while certainly Advent is that, Advent is much more than just getting ready for Christmas. Advent is really about two promises. One promise fulfilled and another promise yet to be fulfilled. We hear about the first promise of Advent in our first reading from the prophet Jeremiah. We'll be looking at chapter 33, starting at verse 14. Now, at this point in Jeremiah's ministry, the Israelites have been conquered by the Babylonians, and they have been exiled from Israel to Babylon. Jerusalem, their capital, is in ruins, and the temple is no more. And the justice that was supposed to reign in Jerusalem and throughout Judah and Israel no longer reigns as the Babylonians commit their horrors. And it is to these people who are in exile from their homeland that Jeremiah delivers this message from the Lord. The days are coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Now remember, in those days, the kingdom of Israel had split, and the northern part of the kingdom was called Israel, and the southern part of the kingdom was called Judah. So when God made a promise to Judah and Israel, he made a promise to all of his people. And what was that promise? The promise that God made was that a member of the house of David would reign over his people forever. And now that Judah and Israel have been destroyed, God is saying that the day is coming that I am going to fulfill that promise. In those days, at that time, I will make a just shoot spring up for David. He shall do what is right and just in the land. In those days, Judah shall be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. And this is the name they shall call her, the Lord our justice. And then he goes on to say in a verse that's not in our reading today, for thus says the Lord, David shall never lack a successor on the throne of the house of Israel. God promises to fulfill the promise he made to David. And this is a promise fulfilled. We know that it happened. We know first that the Israelites returned to Israel and reestablished the temple in Jerusalem and began to live the justice again that God had called for in that country. But we know even more so that God has fulfilled his promise that a member of the house of David shall reign forever over his people. We know that in the birth of Jesus Christ, the promise fulfilled. The second promise, however, the promise yet to be fulfilled, is given to us in the Gospel of Luke. Now, this is sort of a repeat of what we read just a few weeks ago when Jesus was talking to his disciples about the end of the world. And he says to them at Luke 21, verse 25, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth nations will be in dismay, perplexed by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will die of fright in anticipation of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. A daunting vision, to be sure. But that is not the promise. You see, all too often Christians mistake the coming of the end as a promise. Jesus is not promising that this is how the world will end. He's just basically saying that given the brokenness of our world and the imperfections of human nature, things inevitably will unravel and come apart, and there will be turmoil, and nations will rise against nations, and all of heaven and earth will be shaken by it. That's not a promise. That's just a prediction. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. That's the promise. The promise of Jesus is that when the world starts to fall apart and our lives are surrounded by turmoil and it just seems that it's about to all come to an end, that's when the Son of God will come in power and great glory. That is God's promise, and that's the promise that is yet to be fulfilled. A promise fulfilled and a promise yet to be fulfilled. But you see, Advent brings both of those promises together, because Advent teaches us that if God has already fulfilled the first promise in Jesus Christ, then we have every reason to believe that he will fulfill the second promise in Jesus Christ as well. And if we can depend on God's promise, then that promise, even though it's for the future, can have an effect on our lives right here and now. Because promises matter, and a promise for tomorrow affects our lives for today. You see, if we truly believed that in the end God will reign victoriously, then that frees us up to live in God's promise today. Imagine how much different our lives would be today if we really believed that God will win tomorrow. Imagine how different we might live today if we really believed that in facing the many struggles in our own personal lives and the world around us, God ultimately assures us a positive end to it all. You see, when we believe that God will ultimately reign in the world, it's not that we ignore the problems of today, as though we were Scarlett O'Hara saying, "Oh, fiddly-dee, I'll think about that tomorrow." You see, when we believe that God will ultimately reign in the world, we can live with those problems, and we can engage them, sharing our lives and our love and even our fortunes with others, because we don't have to fix everything ourselves. If we truly believe that God has already saved the world through Jesus Christ, then we don't have to save it ourselves. Jesus warns us to beware that our hearts do not become drowsy from carousing and drunkenness and the anxieties of daily life. Because thinking that we can save the world and then trying to do it on our own is exhausting work. When we try to fix everything on our own, that's when we become discouraged or depressed and begin to resort to drinking and carousing and medicating and worrying our problems away. Instead, if we can trust in God's promise to bring this world to a just and righteous end, then we can heed Jesus' word in the midst of the greatest turmoil around us. Stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand. And that is the difference that God's promises make right here and now. That in the face of this world, with all of its turmoil, we don't hold our heads low. We can stand with confidence and courage, with our heads erect, knowing that our redemption is at hand. Because promises make a difference. They make a difference here and now. And God's promises are no different from anything else. Advent reminds us that God's promises are reliable. He's already fulfilled the promise that we'll be celebrating at the end of Advent, and he will fulfill the promise that is to come at the end of time. So believe in the promises of God. Trust that Jesus will return to right every wrong, to heal every hurt. And then stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand. Amen. Amen.